gustibus non est disputandum. There is no arguing about taste. Yet, we have a famous remark from Haydn to Leopold Mozart, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me, for he has taste and a profound knowledge of composition." Taste comes first, before craft. And indeed, with Mozart, that is clearly the case. A few years ago at a party, the host had assembled a number of recordings of short excerpts of orchestral music from the late 18th century, most of it by minor composers, but they also put in a few snippets of little-known works of Mozart. Our job was to declare each excerpt Mozart or not Mozart. And I don't know every piece of Mozart, and I was somewhat ashamed at not being 100% accurate in my guesses. Because Mozart's language is, for the most part, not essentially different from that of his colleagues. It is just many times more sophisticated, for he had taste. Now, is there any concrete path to understanding what Haydn might have meant by taste? In one way, I believe there is. It seems to be true in virtually every language that one finds the perfect adjective for what one wants to express, and then, oops, I just used that word in the last sentence. I will have to find another. Now, I believe that this shows a longer view of thought than merely the sentence at hand, and seems to be the sign of any good writer or orator. And from this point of view, in music, no one has ever surpassed Mozart. In 1956, musicologist Edward Lewinsky wrote an article in the Musical Quarterly magazine comparing a work of Mozart to a similar work by Johann Christian Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's youngest son. Mozart had actually met Johann Christian Bach at age 6 on his first trip to London, and Bach had had a strong influence on the young Mozart's developing style. Now here on the screen we see incipits of two piano sonatas, one by Johann Christian Bach and one by Mozart. The initial thought, the initial stuff, the initial kernel, if you want, of these two pieces are very similar. That's Johann Christian Bach. And this is Mozart. Now, I claim that one of these is just as good as the other. Maybe Mozart has a slight edge because of the left hand, that he begins with an aspiré, and that gives a lighter feeling to the whole thing. He certainly could have written. Now, let's see what happens. Here's Christian Bach's first two bars. How does he answer it? Well, how does Mozart answer his? It sounds like it's completely natural, but of course it's really quite different and more sophisticated. Now, if Mozart had done what Christian Bach did, we would have this. Could we do to Christian Bach what Mozart did in his second? Well, perhaps we can. That's quite good, actually, and I think that's just fine. But now the trouble is that how does Mozart continue? This is new, and then this, and then we have, I mean, Mozart in every single bar is doing something new. Now, I tried to go back and do something like that in Christian Bach, but it turns out that I'm not really as good as Mozart. Here's what Edward Lewinsky tells us about this. The minor composer spends his invention in the first few measures. The rest is more or less self-perpetuating. The great composer never abdicates in favor of automatic propagation. He is permanently engaged with all his powers of concentration and imagination. Now, I'm a performer, I'm not a composer. Can we apply a similar thought to performers? I would adapt Lewinsky's dictum like this. The ordinary performer sets up her modus operandi in the first few measures. The rest is more or less self-perpetuating. The great performer never abdicates in favor of automatic propagation. She is permanently engaged with all her powers of concentration and imagination. Now, of basic importance in the examples we're going to look at here is the notion that music is like speech and is therefore in need of proper inflection. There are no languages in the world that are spoken like this. If any piece of music consists of evenly marked notes, we must learn how to make them uneven in order to convey their musical sense and syntax, just as we do in speech. Now let's look at a piece with nothing but continuous eighth notes. How can we find its proper inflection, and does the composer actually help us? What information does Schumann provide? Now, if we look at this, the rhythm seems to be da 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 da. Well, let's look a little more closely. First of all, there is a slur over the first bar. What do we know about a slur? A slur means that all the notes taper gradually towards the last one, which is the weakest. But we also know that notes under a slur are slightly compressed. So if I still just look at the rhythm, it wouldn't be da 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 da, but would be da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da da. And of course, notice that it's in 2/4, not dee da da da, but dee da da da. So therefore, I will play the first bar, which I think is fine. Now, what happens in the second bar? Well, in the second bar, he adds another voice. Third bar seems to be like the first, and the fourth bar also has two voices, except now they are in verse order. But there's also the word diminuendo there, which presumably means that not a retard, but slightly getting slower. Then what happens? Then we start having two bars together. So if all the notes under a slur belong together, da 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 dee, da 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 dee, da 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 dee, da 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 da. So we started with da 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 dee da da da. Now we have dee da 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 dee da da da. And of course we also have these signs, which, as we know, mean not accelerando, but somehow move forward and somehow come back. So let me play this as I would play it. This is now the second movement of the Schubert Sonata in B major, D575. Here we have another example of 4 two-bar phrases all built on the same rhythmic pattern. So da 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 dee da da. D da 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 D da da. D da 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 D da da. D da 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 D da da. Well, again, let's see what Schubert tells us. Now, the first thing we have to talk about, which I always want to talk about, is dotted rhythms. We are all taught, when we're taught how to read music, that when you have a dotted rhythm, a dotted quarter and an eighth, a dotted eighth and a 16th, that the long note takes up 75% of the time and the short note 25% of the time. But all of the sources in the 18th and 19th century tell us never to do that because it sounds stiff. Da, 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 da. It's very stiff. Now, what's interesting here is that there are two dotted rhythms. The first one I would play rather late because it's just getting lighter. It's certainly not D, da, da. It's not, certainly isn't that. And then you have this one. That one I would play quite differently because that's rhythmic. We also have that Schubert gives us this, showing us to move to the middle. So let me play this. And I think it's important to say, Schubert, who died at age 31, wrote more notes per minute than any other composer in the canon. And it's hard to imagine that he would sit infinitely fussing with this to get all of this sophisticated thing. I think he wrote down what he heard as he was writing quickly. And we have to learn how to read it. This, of course, I would also take more time than I took here because he wrote more notes. He could have written, but he writes. Now what do we have? Forte piano. So this means fuller, richer. I believe that forte piano, sforzando, accent always take time. We accentuate things, we don't exaggerate things. So this will take more time than... So again we have this, showing... And finally this... Let me play it. Chopin was often accused, even in his own day, of overloading his scores with too many small expressive details, especially too many pedal marks, far more and more detailed than virtually any other composer in the standard canon. Now, here is a mazurka, Opus 17, an early mazurka. What you see on the screen here is the first German edition, but I have also checked the first French edition, and everything we're talking about here is there as well. Chopin often sent out by hand manuscripts to a French publisher, the English publisher, the German publisher, and sometimes they're different, but in this case everything we're talking about is exactly the same. Now let's just look a little bit. You have... Take the pedal off, and you have a slur, da-dee-da, and we know what a slur means, right? Come together. Then you have, hold the pedal while you continue, and now take the pedal off, and you have two separate notes. So this is separate. First time it was, and now it's, a dotted rhythm here that has no slur on it of any kind. But the next one has the slur into the downbeat, which presumably means that this second one in bar 11 is played faster than the one in bar 9. Let me play this. Etc. On your screen, you will see all the performances I found on YouTube. None of them do any of these things. They play the first statement and the second statement exactly the same. Better than I did, but that's what they played. I'm sure there's somebody somewhere who does these things and who has really studied this, and I don't think it's a question of pianos. I am playing here on a copy of an 1815 Johann Fritz by Paul McNulty, but you can do this on a Fritz, on an Erard, on a Steinway, or a Bösendorfer. All of these things are perfectly possible to do. I also don't believe that I'm obliged to do this. I don't believe you have to play this exactly this way, but I do believe that when you practice, and I had to practice very hard, it's hard to learn this, do this, take the pedal up here, do this detached. It's worth it because it brings you into Chopin's world, into his kind of taste. We have spoken about taste in regard to greater and lesser composers, but also in regard to greater and lesser performers. There is, however, a third group we have not yet addressed, the audience, the listener. Now, taste is not an inborn characteristic. It must be developed. Lessing, if I remember correctly from my German literature seminar, described taste as seemingly intuitive, deriving from a number of previous reflections and judgments. I am always rather taken by Indian classical music, but I haven't heard enough of it to understand its subtleties as I do those of Bach or Schumann or Debussy, for example. I recently saw an old movie from the 30s called The Devil and Miss Jones. And it's about the richest man in New York who owns this big department store. I suppose it's like Macy's. And he wants to know what his employees think of him, so he takes a job there selling in the shoe department. Well, the young people like this old guy, and they invite him to go to Coney Island for a picnic on Sunday. And they say, we'll bring them all the food, you bring the wine. So he goes home to his mansion and takes his butler and goes down to this enormous wine cellar, picks an 1875 Mouton Rothschild or whatever, and brings it to the picnic. And so they pour it out, and these young people taste it, and boom, they spit it out. They say, my God, who sold you this? Whoever sold you this cheated you. This is just horrible. Maybe if we put it in Coke, it'll become palatable. So taste is something that has to be developed. Now, I'd like to look at an example you see on your screen of Haydn. Now, this is in the first movement, the closing theme of the grandest of all Haydn sonatas that he wrote in London. And let's look at what happens. Now what happens? that's fine. Now, let's see what happens at the end when this is now in the tonic. Everything is the same. Now we have this and this. The listener says, well, we'll have that. And what does Haydn do? My God, and then I love that. Anyway, Woody Allen, in his movies, will have some sort of joke at the end, which is only understandable if you remember what was said 2 hours earlier. Woody Allen goes to the showings of his films. If people didn't laugh, he wouldn't keep doing it. Haydn was 63 years old when he wrote this. Most famous composer of his time. For these London audiences, I believe the London audiences must have fallen off their seats with laughter. Now, how can we as performers, can we bring Haydn's joke? Can we have people falling off their seats? I'm not quite sure, but I would like to tell the following story, which I think is pertinent. Many years ago, a friend of mine, the distinguished Norwegian pianist Liv Glaser, was given a big award. And there was a ceremony and a concert, and I happened to be in Europe, and they invited me to play there as a surprise, and that was great. Well, one of the things that happened during that evening was that there was a 70-year-old, maybe 75, woman, very famous Norwegian actress apparently, who recited a poem for 15 minutes in Norwegian. Now, I do not speak Norwegian, but I know English and some German, and I was able to figure out what this thing was about, that this woman, her man, her husband, her brother, her father, her lover, I don't know what, was off to sea and was drowned. Now, that might not even be right, but what's important to say here is it was one of the most moving things I ever heard, because this woman imbued every single word and every sentence and every expression with so much, what would I call it, expressive depth and clarity that one couldn't help but be swept along. I believe that the kind of careful expressive markings we have seen in the manuscripts of such composers as Schubert and Chopin wish to impart to the player understanding of the subtleties of their compositions, indeed to inspire greater depth of expression, more refined taste in the sense defined in this short talk. Urtexts, that is to say original manuscripts, are often wrongly considered as some kind of holy writ to be obeyed in an exact and absolute fashion. The kinds of expressive markings we have been looking at here are suggestive rather than prescriptive, leading sensitive interpreters to more flexible interpretations than a simple rhythmic notation of eighths and quarters is able to communicate. In our students and in ourselves, we must work to gain the deepest possible understanding of the works we play. And the great composers, if we pay attention and know how to read their expressive markings, will help us as virtually no other guide can. We've endeavored here to show that there is far more expressive information in notation than is generally realized, and that deep and insightful study is the first requisite towards their best realizations.